welcome back to my channel, and today is part 9 of What Would the Elves Wear If They Were Real, where I'm going to be making some Elvish stockings and also some Elvish shoes. Yes, I'm going to be attempting to make shoes, and no, I've never done this before, so it's very possible that this will be a total failure, but we're going to give it a try. If you've seen the previous parts of this series, you know that I'm able to put together basically an entire Elvish outfit, except I realized that I don't have any socks or shoes, and the modern socks just weren't really working for me. It wasn't keeping the vibe together because I want to feel entirely like I am an elf living in Middle Earth. So I have leftovers of this material, which is what I used to make the Elvish dress a while back, and I think this will be very suitable for making some stockings. Here is a sketch of the Elvish stockings that I plan to make. This design for stockings is basically how stockings were made through most of the medieval period, and of course in the medieval era and basically any time prior to like the 1920s, stretchy materials were incredibly difficult to create. So if you didn't have incredibly finely knitted socks, they basically wouldn't be stretchy. As an alternative for stretchy materials, stockings would often be made with a non-stretchy material, but cut on the bias, which means that it's not going with the grain of the weave. So I wouldn't just lay the fabric flat like that and then cut out my pattern pieces. I would slant the fabric and then cut out my pieces. This of course doesn't make the material entirely stretchy, but it gives it a little bit of give. For this structure of making stockings, there are 3 pattern pieces. One piece is the sole, of course, which is basically just the shape of your foot. Another piece is this little bit that goes over the top front of your foot, and then the third piece is that sort of whole part that goes over like your ankles and your lower leg. That part also goes over the back of the ankle and attaches to the back of the sole. It's a little bit difficult to explain, so I'll try my best to show you how it works when I'm actually making them. A lot of the times stockings historically have been made of wool because it naturally is a little bit more stretchy, but I don't have any of that and it's generally kind of expensive, so I'm just going to be using linen. Now for the very difficult part, the shoes. These are made entirely out of leather, and I've been procrastinating this for a long time because leather is quite a process to sew through. And of course with shoes, you have to repeat everything twice, which is annoying. And of course this is incredibly expensive because leather is not cheap. I bought these 2 sheets of leather on Etsy a little while ago, and it's super nice and thick and really durable, but it still has some nice flexibility. So this will be used to make the upper, and then I also have these soles, which are also leather, but they're about twice the thickness of the material we're using for the upper. This is exactly how these came. They're probably like a size 12 or something, and I'm like a size 7.5, but my feet are very wide and I wanted to be sure that I had enough space to really precisely trace the shape of my foot. The shoes actually have a very similar structure to the stockings, except they'll be obviously a little bit bigger so that they can fit over the socks. They're also a little bit different than the stockings in the way that there's this sort of tongue piece that goes right underneath the lacing. Amongst other things, this sort of helps them be extra waterproof, whereas if you didn't have anything under the lacing, it would be a lot easier for water to like leak in there. As far as how I'm going to be stitching these, I'm going to be doing something relatively similar to how it was done in the medieval era. To learn how this was done, I watched Morgan Donner's video about making medieval shoes, and I'm not doing it exactly the same. For one thing, I don't have boar bristles, and I also don't have a last, which is sort of like a wooden foot that you can sew the shoe around. So I will just have to sew these on top of nothing, which might make it a little bit more difficult, but you gotta do what you gotta do. As for the design of these shoes, visually speaking, they're kind of similar to medieval shoes, but not completely. You might notice in the Lord of the Rings and the Hobbit movies that elves usually wear boots, like Legolas wears knee-high boots. That was entirely constructed by the costumers for the movies. I get why they made that decision, but in the books, Tolkien specifically describes the kind of shoes which elves wear. In the Fellowship of the Ring, when they are climbing a snowy mountain, Frodo specifically notes that Legolas is not wearing boots at all, but just these very light elvish shoes. It's sort of implied that there is some sort of magic or power about the shoes that makes it so that you can wear them in any sort of weather. Obviously my shoes will not have that kind of power, so they will probably not be particularly practical for the winter, but I'd like to honor that aspect of the books. Now that I've explained my designs, let's start making the stockings. I'm going to start drawing out the pattern, and I'm going to start with the sole of the stocking. So I'm just going to put my foot onto this piece of paper in a relaxed position and trace it. It's quite light, so it's difficult to see, but I'm just going to sort of even it out and darken it. And there I have the sole. For the next piece of the pattern, I'm going to do the top part of my foot. So for this, I'm going to sort of drape the paper over my foot. I want the edge of the paper to come right up to where my ankle starts, and then wrap it over to where it touches the floor, and that's where I'm going to make the mark. This piece needs a little bit more guesswork than the others. Now I'm just going to even this piece out a little bit. I'm just going to label this the front. Now to see if this works a little bit better, I'm going to cut it off but leave a bit around my drawing, just so that if I need to make some alterations, there's still room. Okay, it looks like it actually needs to be a little bit smaller. And that looks a lot better than it did before. This last piece is a little more complicated, and it's also a lot bigger, so I'm gonna need to tape a few pieces of paper together. This is the piece of the stocking that needs to fit around most of my leg. Now, just looking straight down, I'm gonna measure how wide my foot is right at this point where my foot meets my ankle. That's about 3 inches. And take half of that measurement, so half of 3 inches is 1.5 inches. I'm gonna mark that right here. Now I'm going to measure from the floor straight upwards so that it reaches the top of my foot where the beginning of my ankle is. And for me, that is also 3 inches. And I'm going to mark 3 inches this way also. Now I'm going to draw a curve from this point to this point, going like this. Now I'm going to cut this curve out. So this curve should be able to fit comfortably like this on your foot. So this next part is a little bit tricky. I need to draw this shape that's on the underside of my leg. So to do this, I have the little curve right over here. Try your best to keep your foot in a flexed position. Line up the bottom of your heel with the edge of the paper down here. And then I have my shin lined up with this edge of the paper. Now I'm going to take my pencil and trace this curve. Now I'm just going to even out and darken this line. So now you should have a shape that looks something like this, but you're going to want to cut it out a little bit bigger than it looks. So I'm going to cut about 1/2 inch to 1 inch outside of this line. So this is actually just the first draft for this pattern piece. We're going to have to refine it a little bit more. The reason for that is we traced this curve just by looking straight down, and it needs to be able to wrap around your leg. So you'd find that if you use this pattern piece as it is, the stockings would end up being too small. So I'm going to tape 2 more pieces of paper together. I'm going to lay the pattern piece on top of this new 2 pieces of paper and trace it out. This little curve that we made is going to stay the same. Hey, this is Editing Miranda real quick. I just wanted to mention why I traced my first draft to do on another piece of paper instead of like just altering it a little bit more before I started cutting it out in the first place. I did that because this way I can keep the first draft of this pattern piece, and in case my altered version doesn't really work out, I still have the first draft to trace again to alter. I don't know how well I explained that, but I hope that kind of makes sense. It's not totally necessary to do this, I just wanted to have that little extra bit of precaution. Now back to past Miranda. This curve we drew, which is very light, you probably can't see it super well, but now I can actually tell where the different parts of my leg are. But now we can refine these a little bit more to make sure that they actually fit. I'm going to start with the biggest part of my calf, and I'm going to take my measuring tape and measure all the way around my actual calf. Now I'm going to divide that measurement by 2 and mark it right here where my calf is on the drawing. And now I'm going to measure the smallest part of my ankle. This actually already matches up nicely with my drawing as it is. Now I have the drawing a little bit more refined, and I'm going to cut it out. It's time to cut out the pattern pieces, and as I said before, I'm going to be cutting these out along the bias, which means I'm going to be laying the pattern pieces slanted across the grain of the fabric instead of going with the grain of the fabric like that. This gives the finished garment a tiny bit of a semi-stretchiness. Unfortunately, cutting along the bias does usually take up more material. For this main big pattern piece, this is going to be mirror cut, meaning along this straight edge, we're going to cut it on a fold. So the fabric will be folded over, and then the straight edge will be lined up with the folded edge and then cut out. However, because of the amount of fabric that I have, I don't really have space to just do that with this. I'm going to have to do a little bit of piecework. So I'm going to cut this pattern piece in half. So now I can mirror cut both of these separately and then sew them back together to get the entire piece. This practice of sort of patching pieces together is generally referred to as piecing and was done through all kinds of different time periods to conserve fabric. So I'm going to start cutting these out by laying them on the slant of the fabric and then leaving a little bit of a seam allowance. I'm doing a bit of a 1930s look today. What do we think? Okay, so I have all the pieces of the stockings cut out and ready to sew together, and for quite some time I've been procrastinating actually sewing them together because, to be quite honest with you, I'm not that hyped to make the stockings, but I need to make the stockings in order to make the shoes, which I do want to make, so we are going to get these stockings done. So I'm going to sort of lay all of these pieces out on my feet to show you how they sort of fit together, and we're gonna get to just sewing them together, and I'm not going to be doing any embroidery for a few reasons. One of the reasons is because these need to sort of go with a lot of the different Elvish clothing, so I don't want to like commit to another color to go with these because that'll just make them a little bit less versatile, but also because if these stockings were actually a part of a regular wardrobe, they would be worn a lot and they need to be washed a lot, and embroidery with washing a lot can kind of get worn out a little bit more quickly, and I want these to be nice and long lasting, so I'm not going to embroider them. Okay, now let's lay these out on the feet. Okay, so this is the first piece. Obviously this is just the sole of the sock. Then we have this piece that has this little sort of U-shaped section cut out at the bottom, and that little U shape is gonna go over the foot like that. This little bottom edge will sew down to the sole, and then the back will sew together. Then we have these square sections, which is just that little extension part to make the stockings taller. And then we have this U-shaped piece, which just goes over the foot like that. So the first things that I'm gonna sew together is this piece, and then it's a little extension bit, so that it becomes one big piece. And then once that's done, they'll be folded in half, right sides together, and the back seam will be sewn. And then separately, I'm gonna sew together the sole and this little U-shaped bit. I'm gonna be sure to pin these together before I actually sew them to make sure that they fit properly. And then we'll sew that big tubey part that goes over the leg to this sort of slipper thing. So you're gonna end up with all of these pieces sewn together with seam allowance on the inside of the stocking. So I'm gonna get stitching. Hello, it's another day and I'm doing a bit of a hobbit look today, and I have finished sewing all the main seams for the stockings, but now I need to flip them inside out. And this next part is probably going to take the longest. It's going to take a very long time, but it will be worth it because it'll make these stockings be super strong and last a really good long time. I will be felling all of the seams. All of these seam allowances, they're going to be folded under themselves and then whip stitched into place. Before I get started on this, I want to mention something that I have talked about on my channel before, but it's a little sort of a hack that I like to do for felling. I like to fold the seam allowance over twice and then pin one end of the seam to like a cushion. I like to pin it to my bed, and that way there's tension on the fabric, but I still have both of my hands free to do like the folding and the stitching. So now let us spend many an hour felling. I did forget to mention that I trimmed one side of the seam allowance first so that when I fold it over it's a little bit less bulky. Okay, it's another day, and I spent well into the previous night felling these stockings. So I've finally finished them both. They're nice and clean on the inside and on the outside. I also hemmed the top edge of the stocking to make it clean. So that means that the stockings are done and we can almost move on to the shoes, but first, let's do a little try on. Here you have the whole stocking. It actually kind of looks like it has the whole shape of a leg before you even put it on, so that's good. Because these don't have a ton of stretch, you do need to be sort of careful when you put them on so that you don't put too much strain on the seams. We have a stocking. Now, as shown in this drawing, these stockings do need garters to hold them up. The garters can be tied over top of the knee or under the knee. People tend to tie them under the knee because it gives you a little bit more mobility. At some point I'll probably make some kind of nice linen ribbon or something to tie these, but for the moment I'm just going to use this polyester ribbon to show you what it'll look like. There we go. You can just leave them like that, or you can also fold the top of the stocking over top of the garter. But because these are a little bit more loose and I can feel that they're not stretchy, my brain automatically goes, they're gonna fall down, even though they're probably not, because the garter sort of just goes right over your calf, and your calf stops it from falling down, or your knee, depending on where you put the garter. But yeah, it kind of feels a little bit funky, but I'll get used to it. I might have made these a tiny bit too baggy. They still fit quite nicely, but I'd rather have them be too big than too small, because if they were too small, I wouldn't be able to put them on. So I'm still quite happy with them. But I'm gonna keep my pattern, so if I do these again, I'll know to make them a tiny bit smaller. So there we have our stockings. Let's move on to the shoes. Now, as for the shoes, I am basically going to use the same pattern structure as I did for the stockings, but I am going to need to make a few adjustments and also make extra super duper sure that all of the pieces fit together super precisely. With the stockings, if something was just like slightly off from matching up, I could just sort of like stretch the linen and it was fine. Leather does not stretch like that. Like, it's very hardcore. So I need to make sure that the top piece and the sole really closely fit together and the edges can easily meet up. So I'm probably going to need to do a little bit of adjustment to this top piece, but also on the sole, because with socks, you really have them fit like super duper closely to your foot. Whereas with shoes, you want them to have a little bit more give around the toes. The reason for this is because if you sort of flex your foot like that, your toes actually shift forward ever so slightly. So I'm probably just gonna make the sole a tiny bit bigger and work on adjusting all of the pieces, and then I will hopefully start cutting them out, which I am very nervous for because I only get one chance to cut this, and leather is expensive. Okay, so I'm gonna be really honest. This video is taking me forever because I've been doing so much procrastinating because I'm working with leather and I've never really done this before. The stitching method I'm gonna be using is something I haven't tried before. I haven't used such thick leather before, and I'm really concerned, and I know it's gonna take me a long time, and if it doesn't turn out, I'm gonna be really sad. So I've just been like taking forever, but I really need to just do this. So to try easing my mind, I'm gonna take some leather scraps and try stitching on those first to be sure that I can do it correctly, and then I'll start actually sewing together the main pieces of the leather. Something that's also rather reassuring is that this didn't take as much leather as I thought it would, and I still have this whole sheet left. So if I do screw something up, I at least have plenty of leather to like cut out new pieces if I must. But here is the leftovers from the other piece, so I'm gonna cut two tiny little sections and try doing the stitching. The method I'm gonna be using is inspired by the medieval shoe leather sewing method that Morgan Donner used in her medieval shoes video. So yeah, I'm gonna give that a try. I do not have boar bristles to use as needles. I'm just gonna be using regular needles, and I hope that that works reasonably well. And unfortunately, at the moment, I also don't have an awl, so I'm gonna try using a really thick needle instead. If that turns out to not work, then I know somebody who can lend me an awl, so I'll just have to wait a couple of days until I can get it. Okay, so here are the pieces that I'm gonna try stitching together. Something that's interesting about sewing together really thick leather like this is that you don't need any seam allowance. The edges are just going to go straight together like that. Okay, so here is my selection of needles. This is a big, thick embroidery needle that I'm gonna use to sort of poke the hole. And then these are the two needles that I'm gonna be using to do the actual stitching. You'll see why I'm using two needles in a second. Every single stitch uses both of the needles for this method. I'm gonna start by threading one needle on one end of the thread, and then I thread the other needle on the other end. And that is how the thread is prepared. I don't even need to tie a knot. Here are my two pieces, and I'm going to be working from the sort of rough side of the leather. I'm going to start by using my super thick needle to poke the hole that the other needles will go through. The first part of the stitch is the most technical part. I'm going to put the needle in really close to the edge right here and push it through at an angle so that it comes right out at the edge right here. So there's what it looks like. You can see where it's going in and where it's coming out. So this will not actually be quite visible on the other side because it's not actually coming out of the other side. It's going out of the edge. And now to connect it to the other piece of leather, I'm going to go in through the edge and come up right near the edge, just like I did for this, but sort of reversed. Now I've taken the big needle out and I'm going to take my smaller needles. I'm going to put one in through the edge on one side, and then put the other one through the edge on this side. So this is where the line of stitching starts. To do my first actual stitch, I'm going to do the same thing that I did before with my big needle to poke the holes. So I'm just doing this a tiny bit in front of where the needles started. I do definitely think that this would be a lot easier if I had an actual awl, just because there's not much for me to actually grab onto to press the needle in, but I think I can probably get started just with the needle. Now that I have the next hole poked in there, I'm going to take my needle on the right and put it in to the right hole and have it come out of the left hole. And now I'm going to do the opposite with my left needle and put it in through that left hole and pull it out through the right. Now to add a little bit of strength on both sides, I'm going to take the needle and put it through the loop on the same side. And then I'm going to pull tight on the stitch. And there you have your first stitch. If I flip it over, you can see that the stitch doesn't show through on the other side. This gives it a really nice clean seam, but you do need to be really careful not to ever poke the needle through the other side, or you will have a few spots where you can see the thread. This is actually the first time that I'm doing this stitch, and I think that that has turned out really quite nicely. As you can probably tell, this will take a very long time because each stitch takes quite a lot of effort and attention, but it does clearly make a really nice strong seam. So I'm just going to try a few more stitches on this piece just to be sure that I have it down, and then I'll move on to working on the actual pattern pieces. Okay, here's my little sample. I didn't do the whole thing, but I did that little sort of half of the seam, and it's nice and strong and you can't see the stitches from the outside, so I think that I'm ready to start sewing together the main pieces. The only issue with this is that I did pull the thread a little too hard at the end and then it snapped, so I think I'm going to maybe double up the thread to make it a little bit stronger and also possibly wax it. And I'm going to start by sewing on the front piece to the sole. I'm going to find a way to sort of maybe pin it to the toe here and then work around this side and then work around this side. And then after that I can attach the little back part on the heel, and then I can connect the front part and the back part. If you try this yourself, don't forget to sew the pieces together, right sides together. That way I can sew the shoe together like that, and then with a little bit of difficulty, flip it right side out and the outside will be clean. So I'm going to begin the very long process of sewing this shoe together. Wish me luck. So, it is past 2 o'clock in the morning. This little section took me like hours. So, that's a great use of my time. Here's what it looks like on the inside. I did end up waxing the thread that I was using. I've doubled it up, and then I would sort of like dip a toothpick into the melted wax of the beeswax candle that I have lit and sort of like put that on there and use my fingers to like run it through the thread. That definitely made it stronger. It did snap a couple of times, but I was able to figure it out and tie off the string and everything was fine. But this is like a little over a quarter of the seam for this one piece. And I have to do this whole piece another time for the second shoe, and then I have to do the other piece on the back, and it's gonna take so long. I expect this to take me a fair few days, so I will try to just like get some footage intermittently at random times. One of my issues right now is obviously that I don't have an awl. I will hopefully get one soon. If you don't know what an awl is, it's like a wooden handle usually, and then has like a really thick needle on the end that sort of tapers. It's really thick and then gets thinner at the ends, and that is generally what you're supposed to use to poke the holes that you then put your needles through. But right now I'm just using like this huge embroidery needle, but it's very tedious to use because it doesn't have a good handle for me to grab onto. You gotta do what you gotta do, so it'll be fine. No. No. I pity my past self. This is not true. It will not be fine without an awl. So I'm gonna go to bed now because it is ridiculously late. And I will see you soon with many, many hours of stitching. Alright, I've done a few sessions of stitching on these shoes. I started on the other one, and I have decided I have to wait until I get an awl because this is just honestly wasting my time because it's taking way longer than it needs to. I'm actually getting slower as time goes on instead of faster because I'm hurting my fingers, and that is not necessary. So I've ordered an awl from Amazon. It should come probably tomorrow. I ordered it a couple days ago. So yeah, I'm putting this on hold just until I get an awl because otherwise I seriously am just wasting my time. I feel like there have been many things that have prolonged this project, but I really do want to get moving on this, but I seriously need an awl. So yeah, I will see you when it comes. I have an awl. I'm gonna try out some stitching with the awl, and I really hope that this speeds up the process. It is time for a little update. I am loving this awl. I'm moving like twice as fast as I was before, which is still very tedious, but way better than it was. And it feels even faster than that because my fingers are not in pain anymore, so thank the Lord for this awl. So I finally moved on from this front section of both of these shoes and started on this sort of back heel section. Before I actually started sewing this piece on, I sort of put on what I had of the shoe and fit it together to see that the pattern piece would still work. And unfortunately, I had to change the pattern piece a little bit and recut it. So this is what I have done to change it. Here is the original piece, and here is the new piece. The difference is that it's a little bit longer than before, and also this part sort of curves downwards. This is because it sort of makes it taper towards the ankle a little bit more and makes it fit more closely to my foot. So I had to recut these pieces, which is unfortunate, but I'm really glad that I had the extra leather. So that's how things are going. I'm going to continue stitching. Okay, so after many hours of stitching, I finally finished sewing on the main parts of the upper to the sole of both of the shoes. So now all that's left to sew on is these little pieces, which are basically like the tongue of the shoe that go like behind the lacing, you know? However, to sew these pieces on, I need the shoes to be flipped right side out, and that is quite difficult because this is stiff leather. It's not just like flipping a t-shirt inside out. So I'm gonna try turning these right side out now, and if it turns out to be really difficult, then I'll stick them in a tub of water to soak for a few hours because that will soften the leather and make it easier to flip. You can also see now that I cut these slits into the front of both of the shoes. Okay, with quite a lot of effort, I've managed to flip both of the shoes right side out. And now to put the tongue in, I'm gonna need to cut a little slit right here at the bottom of the front opening. I actually already have this marked in pen on the inside, but it's kind of hard for me to see, so I'm gonna use my phone flashlight and shine it in there so that I can cut along the line. Okay, so now this is what I have on the front of the shoe. It's sort of like a T-shaped slit. Now I'm going to take my little leaf-shaped tongue piece, and that is going to go like that, sort of on top of the bottom of the slit, and then these side flaps will fold over top of it, So that is how the tongue is going to be inserted, and then I'm going to try doing a back stitch along this bottom edge of the tongue to attach it to the upper of the shoe. So this will be pretty much just your regular back stitch, but because it's leather, I'm going to be using the awl to pierce the holes to make it easier to sew through. I finished sewing on that last piece on each of the shoes, so that is all of the stitching finally done. Now the only thing we need to do to finish up the shoes is pierce the holes for the lacing. I'm going to do this with the awl, but I'm going to make the hole much bigger than I normally would for stitching. But before I do that, I'm going to get a measuring tape and a pen so that I can mark where the holes are going to be to make sure that they're evenly spaced. That is the finally finished product of my Elvish stockings and shoes. This has been an incredibly time-consuming project, but I'm super happy with the result. I'm happy to report that I wore these shoes outside and I didn't experience any leakage. It was quite wet outside and my feet remained entirely dry, so that is great. Now let's talk about a few of the shortcomings of the stockings and the shoes. Starting with the stockings, these do fall down a tiny bit, but not as much as I would have expected. The garters do quite a good job of holding them up. In my original drawing, I drew the stockings with the garters over the knees, but that generally isn't how it would be done a lot of the time because that can limit your mobility a little bit. I think if I do make any more stockings in the future, I'll make them a little bit more fitted than this because that will help even more in preventing them from falling down. Now onto the shoes. Overall, I am very pleased with how these turned out, but there are just a couple little tiny flaws. You can see, especially on this shoe, that some of the stitches are not entirely hidden. They sort of broke through the leather, like that one right there, but like that's not a huge deal. It's right down by the sole. You basically never see that, and I really don't mind that much. All of the seams are incredibly solid. Like this is not gonna come apart in a hurry. Another little flaw, this is entirely fixable just for the moment. It's a little bit annoying. The holes where the lacing goes into are kind of small. I made them as wide as my awl would allow me, but I couldn't get it any bigger than that. So it took me a lot of effort and finagling to get the laces in there. So basically when I'm putting these on, I don't want the laces to come out of any of the holes. I just make the laces really loose, put my foot in there, and then tighten them because relacing these would be a very big pain at the moment. If at some point I do get a bigger awl, I can just widen the holes and then it'll be fine. It's not a huge concern because I don't really need to relace these super often. Then there's some things that are sort of just because this is my first big leatherworking project. You can see that some of the seams are pretty wrinkly looking because I kind of pulled the thread too strongly. That probably wouldn't have happened if I had like a wooden foot to make these on. So yeah, they're not perfect, but this is my first pair of shoes. Like, I made these? That's super cool! Like, this is a pair of functional shoes that I can wear outside, and I made them with my own hands. So they're not perfect, but it's the first time I made shoes, and I think I did a pretty good job. It hurt me a little bit to take these outside for the first time because after so many hours of work, it's slightly sad to get them all dirty, but shoes are supposed to be worn outside, so. So now I am pleased to say when I wear this entire Elvish outfit, I made every single thing that I'm wearing. Underwear, socks, shoes, dress, undershirts, everything. But there are a few more Elvish things that I'll be making, like I'll probably make another dress at some point. I'd also like to make some sort of armor situation, like a bodice that has chainmail and leather, but that will be quite another time-consuming project because leather work is quite a process, as we have seen. Before I sign off real quick, I'd like to acknowledge the fact that I was not wearing fake elf ears in this reveal footage. The reason for that is apparently in no point in any of Tolkien's writing did he ever say that the Middle-earth elves have pointy ears. That's just a thing they did for the movies because most elves and most other stuff have pointy ears, but Tolkien's elves probably didn't. I'm sorry if I shattered your world a little bit. It kind of shattered my world a tad to discover this. But in a way, I kind of like that because it means that I can look like a Middle-earth elf without needing to wear prosthetics. So that's kind of fun. So that would be it for today. I hope you enjoyed this video. Please comment, rate, subscribe, and all that jazz, and I'll see you guys next time. Bye! We're going to get right to the actual sewing of these. Oops, I spat on myself.